Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Unfiltered Table, a new series hosted by ACNET, a unified talent selection platform. At ACNET, our mission is simple to help organizations and professionals build real momentum in their careers, their teams, and their futures. We believe better hiring decisions create better workplaces, stronger businesses, and a more meaningful professional growth for everyone involved.
People don't leave because they were hired wrong, in my view. They leave because they walked into something different from what they were prepared for, what they had perceived or anticipated. Culture isn't about what's written about in the website or discussed in the interviews, or we put posters all around in the organization. It's how people behave when things are unclear, when priorities clash, when pressure shows up. One of the biggest mistakes we make is talking about culture as if it's something people will figure out after they join in. In reality, culture shows up uh, for a new hire from day one. Great hiring decisions can still fail if leaders aren't aligned on how people are led, supported, and held accountable. And
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Unfiltered Table. I'm your host, Mahima Gupta, and hiring the right talent is often seen as one of the biggest challenges for organizations. But even when companies successfully hire strong candidates, it doesn't always lead to long term engagement or retention. Today's conversation explores the connection between hiring, culture, and leadership, and why these elements need to work together to create real, lasting outcomes. Joining us today is Manu Saigal, a seasoned leader with over 20 years of experience in business transformation, talent strategy, and leadership development. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Hi, Manu. How are you doing today?
I'm good. I'm good. And such a pleasure being here. Lovely talking to you.
Glad to hear it. Is there anything that you would like to tell the audience about yourself or maybe what you do?
Um, so yeah, I'm Manu. I hail from India, Bangalore. I've been here for a very long time in Bangalore. I have covered a lot of other cities in India. Currently, I'm a country manager for a case, and in the past, I worked with multinationals like Adecco and Wipro.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
cool. That's awesome. Thank you for that quick introduction. So let's just jump right in. So I kind of want to start with something that a lot of organizations kind of experience. So, why do organizations struggle to retain talent even when successfully hiring strong candidates?
Yeah. So honestly, I think it starts with a mismatch in expectations, and that's on us as leaders. From the organization's point of view, hiring feels like success the moment someone joins. The offer is accepted, roles are filled, and we move on. But for the person who is joining, that's actually when the real experience begins. So during hiring, people build a picture in their head, not just about the role, but it's also about how it's going to feel to work here, how decisions will be made, how accessible the leaders will be, what kind of a support they will actually get, and then they join, and very quickly they start noticing the small things like who responds when you ask for help, how safe it feels to speak up in few meetings, whether feedback is honest or just polite, whether what was said in interviews shows up in those real life moments. And most people don't leave because they were hired wrong, in my view. They leave because they walked into something different from what they were prepared for, what they had perceived or anticipated. And sometimes, it's also at times one of the variable is the speed. We are always in a hurry to hire, and I think oftentimes we optimize so hard for the speed of hiring that we don't slow down enough to set people up um, you know, once they arrive. So, and that's where culture plays a big role here, but not in the way we usually talk about it. Culture isn't about what's written about in the website or discussed in the interviews, or we put posters all around in the organization. How people behave when things are unclear, when priorities clash, when pressure shows up. And one thing I've seen again and again, especially as organizations scale, is that the employee experience becomes very manager dependent. Two people can join the same company with the same excitement, and 6 months later, one is thriving and the other one is quietly disengaging. And the difference is often the leader in front of them or the manager. And by the time someone resigns, the story usually, probably it started much earlier. It's not, resignation probably is the end outcome, but it would have built up over a period of time. It starts with those small moments where expectations don't quite meet the reality, and those moments just add up. So for me, retention isn't really about fixing hiring. It's about owning the experience that we are creating after someone joins, because that's where belief is either built or it is broken. Yeah.
Okay, so it kind of sounds like it starts with a bit of a gap between, what is promised and then what is experienced. But I'm curious to know, when you were talking about culture just now, does culture, in your experience, play a role immediately when a candidate starts their job? Or is it something that's kind of introduced to them, or something that they have to adapt through over the course of, the first 6 months of them starting? I'm curious about that.
Yeah, I think, Mahima, one of the biggest mistakes we make is talking about culture as if it's something people will figure out after they join in. In reality, culture shows up for a new hire from day one, or I would say often before they even formally start, during the interview process. What was the experience? As simple as, you set up time for interview. Did the manager show up on time? Or how many times it got rescheduled and things. So these are small indicators of how culture of an organization is, and shows up much before somebody joins in or gets into the organization. And over the years, what I've learned is that when candidates they ask about culture, they are rarely talking about the values that we generally speak about. What they are really trying to understand is that how does the place actually work? How are the decisions made when priorities conflict? How much of autonomy will I really have? What happens when things go wrong? How does my manager behave when he or she is under pressure, or typically during those Monday morning calls, the stand up calls, or the quarter end pressure, or if there's an escalation that comes in. Those are the pieces that they are wanting to understand. What would it be, and how is the organization going to react when such things happen? And that's what they want to understand. If we don't bring those realities into the hiring conversations, we are setting up people with an incomplete picture. And I have personally seen hires, they struggle not because they lacked capabilities, but because the environment that was required for a style of working, they were not prepared for it. There's also sometimes some misalignment, especially in the fast changing organizations we talk about, or the startups, when, the role someone joins in often is not the role they will be probably carrying out 6 months later, because the role is also evolving. And if we do not acknowledge that during the hiring, the frustration is almost guaranteed, because will get into a job shock. This is not what I signed up for. And that's when it really hits. Culture can't be, and it's not an orientation topic. It has to be part of the decision, the hiring decision itself. And this is where hiring managers play actually a very, very huge role. We often talk about some of these hiring processes that are part of the HR portfolio. Yes, of course. HR can, HR can design a great process, but the lived culture is experienced through the manager. The candidate is, you know, they're often watching how the managers speak, listen, they challenge, and they respond. And more often, they're watching it very closely than what we realize. And sometimes leaders worry that being honest about the culture will scares the candidate away. But in my experience, I think it has been the opposite. One needs to be honest about what they are going to see when they join. Um, uh, Honest about the things that are not working right in the organization, and these are the pieces where you may get frustrated and things like that. So that honesty kind of attracts the right people, and it filters out the wrong ones very early on, which is a much better outcome than a resignation 6 months later. I think for me, integrating the culture into hiring, it means fewer curated messages, not those brushed messages, but more, it's more real conversations. And exactly, showing the candidates what success looks like here and also what might frustrate them eventually. And it's absolutely fine so that they're prepared for it. Because when people join with open eyes, they are far more likely to stay, adapt, and perform. So that's my view on that.
Yeah, no, that's interesting that you said that it starts on day one. I can see that, and I do understand how honesty will really kind of get rid of that weight that a lot of leaders face, which is, oh my gosh, my candidate doesn't actually fit the culture of this company, and they're not representing this company, or they're not aligned in the way that we want them to be. So, basically, what I'm hearing is that hiring success doesn't always align with candidate experience.
Absolutely.
If this gap exists, to me, it kind of poses a bigger question, which actually perfectly sets up into question two, which is amazing, which is how should organizations think about culture as an integral part of hiring, not just a post joining concept?
I think this is where the conversation really shifts from hiring to leadership, because once someone joins, hiring is technically over. From that point on, it's the employee experience. The employee experience is shaped almost entirely by the leadership behavior. I have learned this the hard way. Great hiring decisions can still fail if leaders aren't aligned on how people are led, supported, and held accountable. So what employees actually experience every day it's not the policies or the frameworks, it's actually their manager. And when I say it is the manager, it is how reachable they are, how clearly they set the expectation, whether they coach or they are just reviewing the outcomes, whether they say one thing publicly and do another thing privately. What is the say do ratio and how high is it? And this is where I think leaders sometimes underestimate their impact. We often, talk about culture at an organization level, but in my view, in reality, culture is lived at a team level. Two teams, same company, same values, completely different realities depending on the leader or the manager who is leading it. And I have seen strong hires, very strong hires, absolutely A-class hires disengage simply because they didn't feel heard or supported. Not because the job was wrong, but because the leadership environment wasn't what they expected or what they needed. And actually, the flip side, the opposite is also true. The average role can feel incredibly fulfilling under the right leader. You will feel that it's so fulfilling and purposeful. Even the normal roles, you could be doing wonders in stars under the right leader and grow under the right leader. So for me, that was a big mindset shift. It made me realize that leaders don't just inherit the talent, they actively kind of shape the outcomes. And when leaders take ownership of coaching, trust, clarity, retention stops being a mystery. When that ownership is missing, even the best hiring processes won't save you. So I truly believe hiring outcomes don't end at the onboarding, they are actually reinforced or they are undone every day through those leadership choices. And this becomes even more important when we talk about other aspects of leadership. We talk about, you know, psychological safety, inclusions, and things like that. Yeah.
So, you're talking about accountability. I feel like that is one thing entirely on its own, but you also said something about communication. I'm just curious, how should an organization or a leader communicate this culture, their company culture to the candidate or for the employee, like how do they communicate their style of work so, the employee doesn't feel disengaged, they don't feel unimportant because, I can imagine that for every candidate that feels unimportant, there's a leader that's like, "I don't understand why they feel unimportant. I'm just doing my job." So I'm kinda
Yeah.
curious, like, how can you kind of mend that disconnect?
Yeah. Yeah. I think this is where I think organizations, they often fool themselves a little. We put a lot of effort into inclusive hiring. We talk about being inclusive, and the first thing that comes to one's mind is that we should have diverse panels, and we should have fair processes, we should have broad outreach. And that's important, for sure, it's important. But hiring is only the entry point. And when we talk about inclusion, it is tested every single day after that. What I've seen is that inclusion rarely breaks down at the hiring age. It actually breaks down quietly in everyday moments. When I say that, for example, who gets invited into the conversations? When decisions are made, are you part of those decision making processes? There's so many ideas that one could get when you invite those ideas from the team. But um, people are very watchful of whose ideas are getting built on or whose are getting brushed past, even if they are good ideas, right? Who's feeling comfortable disagreeing, and who learns to stay quiet over a period of time. So from an employee point of view, inclusion isn't about intent, it's about whether they feel safe being themselves at work, especially when they have different perspectives. I've learned that leaders play a huge role here, often without realizing it. Something as simply put as, how do leaders react to challenging questions can signal whether it's truly safe to speak up or whether people should think twice next time before answering. So you can definitely hire for diversity, but if the environment is not inclusive, what you are really doing is asking people to adapt to a dominant culture rather than contribute to it. And that's where a good talent really gets lost. Not because they weren't capable, but because they didn't feel they belong or they didn't feel they were heard. And I think it's also these days when you are managing large organizations, the leaders are managing different generations of workplace. You're dealing with millennials, you're dealing with alpha and all of them. And the workforce is only getting younger and younger. And these are the people who want the direct connect. They want to know why and why not, both equally. And the style, the leadership style, the communication style varies from different generations. There are the ones who are more phone call people, there are the ones who are more email people. So there are multiple channels that the leadership team should be using to reach out to the entire organization. So a lot of two-way communication, be open to those feedbacks that are happening. So I think from a communication style, that's how you build inclusive teams. I would believe. I think that only happens when the leaders are conscious of their own behaviors, who they trust instinctively, whose voices are amplified, how open are they truly to dissent or agree to disagree or disagree.
Employees often end up having to adapt to the culture of the company rather than the company adapting to its employees. And that's very interesting to me because you were also talking about how, we have so many different people from so many different backgrounds, different generations, different ways of communicating. Leaders kind of have to always be adapting to who their
Yeah.
employees are. It doesn't sound like this is something that, stops for a year, stops for 2 years, stops for 5 years. It's something that is constantly growing and constantly evolving.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there are different styles for each one of them. There are multiple generations which are there in the organization, diverse backgrounds, and each one, has a different style of handling. The communication style the leader has to adapt to those communication styles for each one of them, and that's what we have been. We've so we can always hire for. I've also seen that organization these days they focus a lot about diversity. We are hiring for diversity, but if the environment isn't inclusive and once they are hired, if they are not engaged well, you lose that talent, and that's where the good talent gets lost, not because they were not capable, but because they didn't feel that they belonged or they were heard. And for me, the real inclusion shows up when people don't have to fit in to succeed. They don't have to edit themselves too much to be able to add value to the organization. And that only happens when the leaders are conscious of their own behaviors. They who they trust instinctively, whose voices are getting amplified. How open are they truly in terms of hearing different viewpoints for a particular problem statement? And that's why I believe that inclusion isn't sustained by just the hiring practices alone. It's sustained by leadership habits day after day. And it's important that the hiring, the culture, the leadership, and all these things that we are talking about, the communication style, the inclusions, belongingness, once they're all aligned, that's when hiring genuinely translates into long-term success. Otherwise, hiring just becomes a tick in the box. Rest of the pieces also tick in the box. But if you want to have a long-term success, or if the organization has to last, they have to really get all of these things integrated and aligned.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And it's funny because I think a lot of times people just think that inclusivity and diversity just means, having access for everybody or hiring all types of people. But
Yep.
it's really not. There are so many different factors that go into allowing a candidate to feel valued, to feel seen, to feel accommodated, whether that's, mutual respect or the ability to say something when they feel like something isn't right, or, the ability to say something when they feel like something is right, whatever it may be,
True.
you know?
True.
So, no, that's a very interesting thought. So, kind of going into our next question, one thing I've noticed is hiring kind of becomes automatically the responsibility of talent acquisition teams. So, how does leadership behavior influence hiring outcomes beyond recruitment?
Yeah. I think for me, the biggest shift is defining how do you define success, right? We still intend to treat hiring as a point in time outcome, there was a role is filled, offer is accepted, onboarding is complete.
Those boxes we're talking about, just ticking them off one by one.
Exactly. And then we have all these measurement criterias. We have this fill ratios and the interview to selection ratios, selection to offer on boards, etc. So we have all these ratios and all are tick in the box. But the employee experience success over time. So those experiences are over time, not at the moment. And one thing that I've learned is that if someone is still engaged or growing or contributing meaningfully in a year in, that's a successful hire. Everything before that is just, you know, kind of potential. And big part of this comes down to onboarding, but not in the traditional sense. I mean, I don't mean the systems or the policies and the presentations. I mean helping people make sense of the organization, explaining how decisions are actually made, what success looks like here, where things might feel ambiguous or frustrating. If it does, then how do you navigate all of that? And when leaders take time to do that early, they remove a load of unnecessary anxiety. And another thing that really matters is closing that feedback loop. Let's say someone leaves early or disengages quickly. We often treat that as an isolated issue, but there's usually a pattern there, something about expectations or leadership or the environment that we didn't get it right. And organizations that learn from those signals and feed them right back into the hiring conversations, they get better over time. And the ones who don't, they keep repeating the same mistake with different people. And they also, some of the organizations I've seen, they watch these signals very early on. Let's say they have these milestone checks like the first 90-day engagement or a manager check-in or the expectation alignment. It's not just an annual attrition per se, or it's those regular checkpoints that they have. These checkpoints give you a lot of signals, and these are leading indicators. They are not lagging. It's not after the damage is done, but these are those leading indicators. And how often do you keep giving some of this input back into the hiring process itself so that the loop, you keep evolving and you keep bettering yourself every time with every case. And finally, this requires leadership alignment. I think hiring can't be something we often say HR owns it and leaders inherit, but I think leaders have to see themselves as accountable for what happens after someone joins, for the experience, for the coaching, for the clarity that they provide. And I believe that when hiring culture and leadership are aligned, retention kind of stops being a mystery. People stay not because everything is perfect, but because they feel supported, they feel understood, and they are part of something very real. And that's when hiring stops being the role, and it starts becoming more about building the organization that actually lasts.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that makes perfect sense. And it's funny because hiring definitely brings people in, but it sounds like it's really up to the leaders on whether or not these employees
Yeah.
succeed or stay, you know? And it kind of goes back to what we were talking about in the last question with the constantly evolving. You constantly have to learn from everything that you do. So that's very interesting.
Yep.
Um, I'll just jump right into our next question because I feel like it sets us up. So, how can organizations ensure inclusion is reflected not just in hiring, but in everyday team experiences?
I think, like how we were, some of these pieces that we spoke a lot about, we put a lot of efforts, I was mentioning, into inclusion. And to most of the people, inclusion is about, bringing in diversity. We talk about the panel should be diverse, or we talk about the process should be fair, or we should have people from different diverse background as part of the broad outreach. And all of that, like I mentioned, is important, but that's only the entry point in the hiring. Inclusion is something that gets tested every day. After that, it's not just into the hiring process. Inclusion is also about, if there are conversations that are happening, are you part of those conversations? If there is a decision making that is happening, are you part of those decision making? If there are some ideas that you are getting in from the team, whose ideas are getting picked up? Or if there's a wonderful idea but it is still getting brushed upon, or it's still getting dropped, how safe are you? What's the psychological safety that the organization has built in? How comfortable are you to speak up? How comfortable are you to voice your opinions? That's where, in all these things, that's where inclusion shows up, and the leaders play a huge role here, often without realizing it. Sometimes as simple as, how are you answering a challenging question? That itself can signal what people would think when they have to ask the same question or some other challenging question next time. They'll come to know whether they would want to ask, or are you just being honest? Are you being transparent, or are you just being polite just to answer the question? So yeah, I think you can hire for diversity, but if the environment is not inclusive, what you're really doing is asking people to adapt to a culture, uh, rather than people contributing to it. So
Yeah.
you're kind of wanting
Yeah.
people to change around you, which is not right. I think the right value is to come in. If you want diverse people, the value is that they should not be editing themselves too much to adjust.
You were sorry, I just have to ask this because it's just pressing on my mind. You were just talking about psychological safety. How big of a role exactly does that play here? And does that mean, emotional and mental safety ability, I guess, to be yourself? I'm just very curious about that. And then also, does that fall entirely on to the leaders?
I think psychological safety is very, very important. When we talk about psychological safety, it is all about how much okay is it to fail? Everybody makes mistake, but is it okay to make a mistake? How is one reacting? And to me, I have always believed that it's okay to fail, but one should fail fast and move on. One should always learn from that mistake and maybe ensure that next time we are not making the same mistakes again and again. But when we talk about psychological safety, it's all about speaking up. It's all about not having that fear in mind that if you have done something wrong, how is it going to be taken up? But more about, putting in those preventive actions, corrective actions, and ensuring that it doesn't happen again. And I think leaders play a huge role to bring in that safety net. It's like a safety net for your employees, and it's more than often say do ratio. What is it you as a leader, what is it that you're saying, but your actions speak something else. And the moment you have this, mismatch between the say do ratio, one would have trust issues in the leader, and you start losing that trust, first in the leader, then with the organizations.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, have those conversations. If somebody is not up to it, perfect, you can move on. And then also, if they are up to it, they know exactly what they're doing, and nobody has to deal with the frustrations of miscommunication, misalignment. No, that makes complete sense. So, hey, thank you so much. That is all the questions I have for you today. But I appreciate all of the insight that you've given us. So I really appreciate it, and, I love, seeing, like,
Mm,
when I was going through your LinkedIn, I love your success, so
yeah.
I appreciate you being here, and the ACNET teams appreciate. So thank you, Manu, for being here today, and thank you for all of the insight you've given us. As we wrap up today's conversation, one thing becomes blaringly clear. Hiring alone doesn't determine success. What really matters is what happens after somebody joins. The alignment between culture, leadership, and everyday employee experience is what ultimately drives retention, engagement, and long term impact. A big thank you again to Manu Saigal for sharing such thoughtful insights and real world perspectives. And thank you to everyone listening to this episode of The Unfiltered Table. If you found this conversation valuable, be sure to like and subscribe to stay updated for more honest discussions on leadership and talent. Until next time, thank you.